are available to see at cnu.org/join. Feel free to visit our site for all the details on our brand new membership levels and benefits, and download our new CNU iPhone app. And if you're not a member already, be sure to join now. So my name is Caitlin Goshal, and I'm the program manager here at the Congress for the New Urbanism, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our guests today, Cary Moon, Peter Park, and Lucy Gibson, and they give us the perspectives of an activist, a planner, and a transportation engineer. Each speaker will share their lessons learned from campaigns in Seattle, Milwaukee, and across the country. And after the presentations, John Norquist, CU's President and CEO, will moderate the discussion and take questions. So please give those questions to me by chatting in, and we'll address as many as we can before the end of our hour. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Norquist, who will say a few words before we begin.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's my pleasure to introduce Cary Moon, which I'll do in just a moment. I do want to point out the purpose of this event is to give people insight in how to deal with urban freeways, what the options are, what some of the predictable problems are when you're trying to adjust the scale or eliminate a freeway. There are a number of places where it's happened in the country. The West Side Highway in New York was the first one, which was eliminated by it falling down in 1975, and then they had to get used to the idea of using the surface streets, and it turned out to work remarkably and surprisingly well. Also, the Embarcadero in San Francisco, the Riverfront in Portland, Oregon, and then in my hometown, Milwaukee, we removed a 0.8-mile section of freeway. Chattanooga, Tennessee took out a section of grade-separated highway along their river. There are a number of places in the world, including Seoul, South Korea, where freeways have been eliminated. Our first speaker, representing a coalition that included the Pioneer Square Business Association and a number of environmental groups, which ended up being called the People's Waterfront Coalition, is headed by an engineer named Cary Moon. She's not a traffic engineer, but she is an engineer. And she thought that Seattle's waterfront should not be blighted with an elevated freeway blocking the views of Elliott Bay. And she also didn't think that the freeway should just be put underground, that it should actually be eliminated, that would be the best outcome. And she encountered a number of obstacles, including the bias of the state DOT toward giant roads that put lots of traffic on grade-separated sections, and also just general fear of doing anything different. There's all kinds of things that she confronted that were very similar to the other places, and the fight is still going on there. They've had their ups and downs. And so at this point, I want Cary, if you could just give us a brief description of what you were going through, what the status of the situation is now, and what you think will happen in Seattle.
Okay, I'd be happy to. And thanks, everybody. This is going to be a great discussion, I can tell already. So just a quick snapshot of our organization and the fight in Seattle. In 2001, Seattle had an earthquake that damaged the elevated freeway along our downtown waterfront. And we've been fighting basically since 2005, had a full-on public discussion, sometimes civil, sometimes not, about how to replace the damaged elevated highway. Our organization and our allies were for teardown and replacement with a solution that invested in a range of improvements to the whole system instead of reconstructing a single segment of highway. And we were promoting actively the vision for the highway-free downtown waterfront as the new civic heart for Seattle. So the solution was basically about fixing local streets to increase connectivity, adding more high-speed transit in the corridor, building a modest urban 4-lane street in the footprint of the State Route 99, or the viaduct as we called it. And so our solution actually fit the need really elegantly because most of the trips on the elevated highway are short trips to and from our downtown core. So this kind of urban systemic solution actually fit perfectly the need for travel in the corridor. And first I want to say thank you a ton to CNU and Center for Neighborhood Technology and Smart Mobility. They've all been incredibly helpful to sort of help us understand the politics and advocacy as well as refine the transportation solution. So our key advocacy strategy was to promote the win-win-win. So, we showed a sensible, effective transportation solution. We showed what could happen once we freed the 22 acres of beautiful waterfront land in the heart of our city. We showed it was the lowest cost solution. We showed it was environmentally responsible and in line with the values Seattle holds dear. And, we showed the vision for Seattle's future. So that was sort of the way we did the advocacy. So the current snapshot of where we are now is that we basically lost the transportation battle, and we seem to be fully winning on making the right vision happen for the waterfront. So I'll tell you a little bit more about where we are now, but first I want to kind of focus in on
Let me ask you what you mean by that so everybody knows.
Okay.
The freeway's being taken away,
yes,
or actually put underground. So one of the things you wanted will happen. The views to the Elliott Bay will be restored.
Yep. And
what you don't like about it is that the traffic that doesn't really need to be there, the through traffic, will still be there, and the connections that come from the highway on each end will come up at a ramp that will flood traffic into one section of the downtown. Is that correct?
Exactly. So because it's underground, before we at least had a pretty porous highway with 7 on and off ramps into our urban core, but the solution the state settled on, a bored tunnel underneath our city, basically concentrates all the access in and out of downtown into one mega interchange that's going to have 60 to 70,000 cars, additional cars a day in this neighborhood with narrow streets and historic buildings. And so they're creating this pretty big urban problem through this solution, and in addition to it being risky and expensive and not actually providing very good access to downtown. So
how likely, Cary, how likely do you think it is that they'll actually end up building this? You're talking about a tunnel being built into the side of what is basically the slopes of Mount Rainier.
Not quite Mount Rainier, but it's a very tricky
foothills of Mount Rainier.
Exactly. The geology and the water table, everything's super tricky. It's a really high-risk place to put a tunnel. So my guess is that, the price is too low, that they're going to start it. They're already $700 million short, but I think they're just going to keep going and keep trying to find the money somewhere. That seems to be the nature of these things. And the only thing that would stop it, I think, would be if there's another earthquake that makes it clear that we don't actually need this highway, or if they start boring and it gets stuck underground and we realize there's no way to get that machine out. Those are probably the two things that could stop it at this point.
Yeah, but you're probably not going to stop it through argument at this point.
Exactly.
So your argument is now shifted to how to keep the approaches from the freeway from extending the architecture of the freeway deep into the city and degrading the connectivity of the downtown urban fabric.
Yep, and we're also working really hard with a bunch of other allies on planning the vision for the 22 acres of waterfront land that will be freed when this viaduct is removed, partly because we're all excited about doing that and it's the right thing to do, and that's why we started this in the first place, but also because we know that if the tunnel does prove to be infeasible, or if the politics shift or they decide not to spend the money, we want to make sure that there's a strong commitment to the waterfront vision so that they don't decide to rebuild another elevated highway. So we're definitely still actively involved in constructive work for the future city. So there's a couple things I wanted to say about sort of advice on strategy and what are the active ingredients for success. I can do that now, or we can weave those in later.
You can do it now, and let me set you up by telling you how CNU and CNT got involved, and we hired Smart Mobility to come in analyzed the work that had already been done by the Washington DOT, that the claim was being made that the water for the Alaskan Viaduct was essential, vital to the port of Seattle, and then using the DOT's own numbers, we found out that actually most of the truck traffic from the port was going straight out to I-5, not using the Alaskan Viaduct. And then the other thing that we found out was that the modal split was fairly low for trucks, being a fairly low part of the traffic on the Alaskan Viaduct, and that the truck traffic that was using the Alaskan Viaduct was making deliveries in and out of downtown for the most part, which argues for a street grid with lots of connectivity, not for a big freeway. And so, we, in this case, without spending a lot of money, we were able to use the DOT's own data, which is a good thing for people that are trying to alter freeway plans in other places to think of. Always look for the studies that exist, even if they were put together by your adversaries.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think when we got people to actually pay attention to the data and could show them the analysis that basically proved our solution was smarter on a lot of different measures, that's how we gained the number of allies that we did have. But in the end, that we kind of didn't read the politics correctly at the state level, and even though we had a lot of support at the city and the county level, the venue for decision making at the state, we did not have the same access to that as the pro-highway people did, and they ended up prevailing with the governor. But I think the couple of things that that might be useful for other cities to think about are two things. One is make a strategy map and update it every 6 months. And by strategy map, I mean sort of answer the questions of who controls the money, who are the deciders, what are they trying to achieve, who do they listen to, and who are the intractable opponents, and how do you minimize their power. So if you kind of go through all those questions and make a map of who you need to get to and how and what will they listen to, what will they pay attention to, that sort of makes clear where to invest your efforts as an advocate. And then the second point I wanted to add was that, for us, the active ingredients that we saw for success were a future vision that embodies your city's values and your future dreams about where you're headed, reframing and giving a pragmatic answer to the transportation question, and Lucy's genius at this, so she's going to talk more about that. A simple cost comparison showing the better value for your solution. Then a populist advocacy campaign that both touches people's hearts and minds, but also gets some key decision leaders as champions out in front with you. And then the last two of those are, I think it's really important to sort of know who the bad guy is or who the threat is so that you can rally people around a common enemy. And it doesn't have to be a person, but it could be an idea or something about the economy of your city. And then finally, always remember you have to tee up the elected officials for a win, that you can't win. You can't be perceived as the champion and the hero. Someone in office has to be the hero, and you have to make sure that you're setting somebody up for that win, because their taking ownership of it will add way more power than you can ever have as outside advocates.
Hey, Cary, could you actually repeat the elements of the strategy map really quick?
Yeah. Who controls the money? Who are the deciders? Who are the key decision makers? What are they trying to achieve? Sort of what are their goals, and how do you get inside, what they're trying to achieve? Who do they listen to? And then the last one is, who are the intractable opponents likely to be, and how do you minimize their power?
Great.
You mentioned the cost issue, and it's really important to establish early on the cost conversation, because if the dialogue is controlled by the people that want to build the giant structures, they'll assume benefits for whatever they want to do and costs for whatever anybody else wants to do. And one of the things we did in Milwaukee when we tore down the freeway there was to frame the issue so that it was much cheaper to tear down the freeway and replace it with a boulevard than it was to rebuild the freeway. And oftentimes the cost of tearing down a freeway is listed all by itself, like somehow you'd have to have the money to do that. The other day I was talking to Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, about the possibility of tearing down the Stevenson Expressway between I-94 and Lake Michigan and Lake Shore Drive. And his first question was, well, who's going to pay for it? I said, well, it would save money. It would save a lot. It would save a lot more money than rebuilding it the way it is. And that's the kind of cost struggle you want to get in on early, so that when we were fighting freeways early on, when they hadn't built them all yet, and the people that wanted to build them were very careful to put low costs on things and high benefit levels. Like, for example, leisure time was valued at twice the national average for leisure time in Milwaukee for the Stadium South Freeway, which ended up not being built, but we caught them at it. And actually they had a strange smile on their face as we caught them at it. So you really need to identify and fight over these ingredients to the cost calculations early on. All right, so now, thank you, Cary, and we'll be back to you during the discussion period.
Okay.
We're now going to move to Peter Park, who is city planner in Milwaukee and also city planner in the city of Denver, an academic, a teacher a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and now a teacher at the design school at Harvard. A Harvard expert, Peter Park.
Thanks, John. Well, I'm not actually teaching at Harvard. I'm actually a fellow, so I'm more the student here. So that's actually quite an advantage. So I'd like to just share lessons and frame them around sort of 4 topics: that of vision, implementation, leadership, and opportunity. So first, about vision, and by vision, what I mean is, in our experience in Milwaukee, it was the importance of having a plan, having a vision, not just a visionary mayor like John Norquist, but a plan, but a plan that, planning is an activity that accumulates and articulates community aspirations. So, of course, it's all about context, it's about constituencies, but it's also about not being afraid of what is right to say. And what I mean by that is we actually contemplated taking down the freeway, and it was articulated in the 1999 downtown plan that was prepared. This was a plan that engaged a whole bunch of folks, business owners, residents, property owners, from downtown, employers and residents, and engaged design professionals. And we also engaged the university. I was actually teaching at the University of Wisconsin and had students studying the possibilities of taking down the freeway. It wasn't so much an anti-car thing as much as it was a pro-city thing. It was about what the possibilities could be. And so this notion of vision, as a previous speaker was talking about, is an important one. Because it's not about a road project. It's about reconnecting a network of streets, of commerce, of culture, and communities. And as John said, setting up a situation so that it actually costs less to the public in the future. So I would say that having a vision and following the spin of planning is important. In the case for us in Milwaukee, when we adopted that idea of taking down the freeways in Milwaukee, we didn't identify where the money would come from. We just said, in the next 20 years it would make sense that these freeways would come down. By fortune, Harley-Davidson Motorcycle Company actually was a major impetus for us to be able to get the county executive and the Republican governor at the time, Tommy Thompson, to agree to use $25 million of what had been languishing, of $241 million of ICE-T money, languishing in that there couldn't be agreement about what to do with this money, and we were able to in an unanticipated situation of an influential company like Harley-Davidson, capitalize on that because we already had a pre-existing vision for what downtown could be. So while I always say planning is human, implementation is divine, implementation is the critical part. And I would say my recommendations there from my experience, thanks to the CNU, we have the principles, the techniques, the tools. We have form-based codes that help us create very clear linkages between physical visions. They help us streamline permitting processes. CNU has been at the forefront of walkable streets and sensible transit, as well as showing models of prudent public investment in infrastructure that creates value by stimulating private sector confidence in investment. One of the challenges I think that often occurs is this question of public land disposition. In the case of Milwaukee, for example, Milwaukee County was the entity that acquired the land for the freeway in the first place, and the land reverted back to Milwaukee County versus it being city-owned or privately owned. And I think that there's a case to be made that assuming success in taking a freeway out, the land that is in the public control needs to be carefully thought about in terms of what that entity is. It needs very capable and professional skills, and I would suggest a singular entity to be in charge of disposal of the land, and an entity that can overcome political interference and the uncertainty that comes with it, especially when it comes to land. If you look at Milwaukee, I think primarily the city-owned parcels and the privately owned parcels around the freeway, former freeway, are the ones that have been the first to develop. I'm not sure how most of the county-owned land is faring.
I think what happened, Peter. I think what happened there was that the city officials, which tend to be the more urban part of the county, obviously, with a lot of people on the city council like Willie Heinz, the president of the city council, who comes from a low-income inner-city district, but he's completely devoted to adding value and more jobs and more economy. He's trying to get his constituents out of poverty. And so he realized that the land needed to be put in the private sector where it could grow and create jobs. Whereas the county, I think they looked at it more like, well, this is an opportunity for them to put all kinds of political constraints and police interest groups. So whether it was the AFL-CIO wanted to make sure that all of the construction work, whether it was private or public, had to have union workers on it, or other groups that wanted things. They went to the county board and they had a big political interest group fight. And so the city land developed right away, and the construction workers did really well because something happened. Then on the county land, things froze up because the interest group gridlock just couldn't come unstuck.
Right. And so those, so I do think that also, relates to my third sort of topic, which is that of leadership. That I think, in my observation, it takes fundamentally those kind of leaders, as John said, and as John is, transformational versus transactional. The transformational leader who's proactive and looking for change for the better versus the transactional, which is kind of the reactive, typical politician looking for how it might benefit their district only or themselves. I think also the quality of leadership that it takes is leaders who can see the opportunity and learn from the past mistakes of others. Post-World War II, the results of our post-World War II city planning are proof of what I describe as a failed experiment. But it was also very deliberate. I mean, Henry Ford, even in 1922, this famous quote, he said, "We shall solve the problem of the city by leaving the city." Well, it happened. It didn't exactly solve the problem of the city. Actually created a whole new set of problems. And I think one of those elements is, the often accepted idea that traffic demand forecasts have to be honored. But that approach is completely outdated and simply been proven to be wrong. And that our, budgeting our capital infrastructure based on what we demand, or what we forecast to be the traffic demand, is proven to have damaged our cities, and we lost much of our cities. What we do have is we have the evidence where urban freeways have been removed, as John mentioned, in San Francisco, in Milwaukee, in Portland, in Chattanooga, things got better. I mean, we know that to be a fact. Where urban freeways were built in cities, the land went down. Where they've been removed, congestion goes down. Private investment increases. Walkability improves. Safety improves. Transit works better. So we need leadership who has the political will and the capacity to understand the multiple contexts of how regional infrastructure affects neighborhoods and the city as a whole. So then where does this leadership come from? Well, obviously it's got to be mayors. But there's a bigger picture to draw, I think, and that is American city mayors. I think we have an opportunity here for American city mayors to work as a collective voice, and I think that is crucial, and I think it could be potent. I think we now stand where we have the opportunity to align our national and subnational agendas as it relates to our economy. As we all know, our national infrastructure is aging. We don't have the money to replace and refix most of it, and in that is a great opportunity. There's often, this quote of Chamberlain or Churchill, I can't remember who, during World War II, where they said, "Gentlemen, we've run out of money, now we have to think." Well, that's where we are. And, rather than, if you think of Einstein's definition of insanity, rather than, doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result. So I think for the future, I hope we have the opportunity to get mayors to act collectively and appeal or demand, in fact, from Washington to prioritize removal of elevated structures or sunken structures versus fixing or worse, replacing with bigger structures, and replace them with at-grade street networks. The urban fabric will heal itself. It's been proven. San Francisco got better. The Waterfront got better, where there's a great boulevard. And relieve, the other part of this is there's a message. We can relieve our federal burden of maintaining these unnecessary roads and cities. The city fabric will heal, and the federal government will have less of a burden on spending in the future, as John mentioned. And I think in this, there's a rural and urban alignment in terms of a long-term reduction in unnecessary freeway money spent in cities. So it's a campaign. Part of my time here as a Lincoln Loeb at Harvard, I'm looking at sort of this original campaign, which took deep root in America, and it's had this amazing and successful kind of embedded in our culture of this country, but it's also been so successfully exported to the rest of the world in ways and places that simply can't be sustained. So there's a bunch of films. There are books like Freedom of the American Road. This was a very deliberate and powerful campaign that created our car-based culture. And it's very interesting if you look at it and study it. It's all these elements of freedom and security, economic growth, and civic duty. And there are very powerful messages in it that surprisingly still persist today. So I would just ask if any of you out there have information or resources to let me know about, let CNU know about, and also mayors and other electeds that you think we should contact, let us know. We need to find them, and we need to find them soon. And just as a conclusion, I just put it this way. It seems to me that it's very un-American to use our tax dollars in ways that reduce the value of private real estate in cities, the most valuable land in our country.
That's a good point to conclude on. Traditionally, Peter, the streets, big commercial streets in urban areas, going back even thousands of years, have had more than one purpose, not just moving goods and people, but also as a setting for selling merchandise and services, and also as a social setting for the community. And so we we look at the street in the city as part of the value of the city, adding to the value of the city. It is, and that's a key thing that CNU would like to inject into the thinking at US DOT and the various DOTs around the country, is that the infrastructure investments that are made in an urban context should actually add to the value of the community where the infrastructure is put, not diminish the value. So with that, we're going to come back for a more discussion among all the participants, but we're going to move next to Lucy Gibson, who's a licensed traffic engineer, transportation engineer, who works for Smart Mobility, which is a firm that is in Burlington, Vermont, and she works all over the country. She's involved in all kinds of transportation reform activities, and she also has designed big roads that carry lots of traffic too. She does the whole range of that kind of work. Lucy, you were engaged in the the initial study that was done concerning the Claiborne Expressway in New Orleans, as well as being involved with your business partner in the work in Seattle, and you've also worked in other contexts as well. What's your take on this issue?
On the NEPA issue, on the value?
Well, just the whole idea of
okay.
transformation of freeways to surface streets.
Well, that's a big topic. What I thought I was
okay, well, you can narrow it down to whatever you like.
Well, one of the things I wanted to do today was provide a little bit of advice when you are engaged in one of these freeway removal projects. You are going to have to convince your DOTs of the merits of doing this. And there's a few things. We've worked in a variety of cities and towns on these. And there's some themes that always come up, and I wanted to give a little kind of advice on what to expect. Some of the arguments will be against a tear down, and how you can hopefully make a positive argument to engineers, planners, politicians, et cetera, to support removal. So if you could go to the next, oops, I think that jumped ahead. Can we go back a few slides maybe?
Is that the right slide?
Well, no, the second slide said common myths about urban freeways. Is that?
Got it.
There you go. So these are some of the common myths, and I just put a few images on slides to help along here. The most immediate response you get from engineering departments that are kind of entrenched in a typical way of doing business is that we need to plan for future growth. Another big argument is there's too much through traffic on this freeway, so we need it to be a freeway. And a third one is there's no alternate routes, so we need this freeway. And if you could go to the next slide. One of the important things we need to understand is that I think we've hit, the way I put it, peak traffic in our country. Can you get to the next slide, Caitlin? Or
yeah, I'm
it has
sorry.
the graph?
I think the slides had been mixed up when they were added.
Oh, okay.
Can you just quickly describe what the slide would look like?
It says driving VMT is declining in the U.S.
Got it.
So this is national statistics, and this trend actually goes well back to the 50s even. But in the last few years, we've seen leveling off or declining in most areas of the U.S. This is a national statistic. It's obviously different in each region. One of the problems is the traffic forecasting models that Peter just mentioned are not showing this trend. They're based on that past of growth, and more traffic, and we need more roads. So, and it's a really important thing to look at the data in your region, which is probably going to show this leveling off or, again, declining in many places. And hopefully convince people that we need to change how we do planning, because the whole paradigm that traffic engineering has faced has changed. And then there's another slide that says Kiplinger on the top. This is another big trend. One of the reasons traffic's declining is baby boomers are getting older and driving less, which is a pretty typical thing, but their kids are not filling in and driving. So young people connect by internet. They like to live in walkable places. They're just driving less. So this trend promises to continue with just those demographics. So the next myth I want to talk about is through traffic. There we go. And this is an earlier slide from the Alaskan Way Viaduct where the DOT was promoting the need to replace the viaduct with a highway. And they're saying the majority of traffic on this road was through traffic. Then we took a look more closely at the data. And if you could go to the next slide that has the two maps side by side. What they were calling through traffic was just through traffic through a couple of the exits downtown, and not through traffic that we think of as long-distance trips. And when we looked at the data with a more sort of correct interpretation, it's only 24% of the traffic is through traffic, and that's the graphic we did on the right. So it's important to kind of dissect the arguments that might be made to promote a highway. There's another slide of rethinking I-81. We did a little bit of work early on the I-81 planning process in Syracuse. There's a lot of angst about I-81, which goes through the center of the city, being an international trade corridor. And if you go to the next slide, what they've done is a pretty good job, I think, in data collection. And these are some maps that have been put out in the initial studies they're doing, and found actually only about 5% or so of the traffic in Syracuse on the highway is through traffic. And that's a really helpful, I think, in this case, to have that information at the outset, that there's not a, dispelling that myth. So that's, again, a good way to go about collecting the data. The other thing to think about is this argument that we need the capacity for the freeway. Now, typically, in the freeway replacements that we have observed, traffic drops by half when it's replaced by a boulevard, which means half the other traffic either disappears or uses other routes or uses other modes. And I've just provided a little bit of the numbers here. You do need to think about where some of that traffic will go and have a reasonable plan to accommodate what you might expect to be diverted. Basically, a lane of freeway can carry on average about 2,000 cars per hour. And one lane of a urban boulevard can carry about half of that amount, about 1,000 vehicles per hour. And that's just because there are traffic signals and interruptions to the flow. But you can accommodate lots of traffic on an urban street network as long as it's connected and people can access the right streets. And if you could go to that last slide, and this is not the last, just by example, the traffic patterns in New Orleans, what we found is that the Claiborne Expressway does carry a fair amount of traffic, but it's mostly going just across town or to nearby locations. And with their great street grid, there are a lot of other routes that this traffic can be diverted to that won't be accommodated by a new boulevard underneath what's now underneath the freeway. So again, just looking at that, where can the traffic go? It's very common that urban highways have a lot of capacity alongside on the parallel routes, because currently most of the traffic gets attracted to the freeway, and there's usually plenty of capacity to absorb it. And then one final kind of engineering argument I want to make is that speed and capacity are not the same thing. You can move a very high volume of traffic at a very moderate speed. And in fact, the most efficient speed for moving traffic along a street is about 30 miles per hour. And that's because the traffic can flow in a much closer spacing to the car in front of it, and therefore actually move more cars per lane. And this is, again, another thing that even a lot of traffic engineers don't understand this, because they've just been taught that speed is good and we need to maximize it. So those are a few of my engineering considerations. And one thought I just wanted to, a couple thoughts I have too in closing is that one is I really encouraging communities to think about a different kind of planning process. Because our models of forecasting are so flawed, there's a concept of backcasting, where you look out ahead into the future and think, what do we want this road or boulevard to be like? How many people do you think should be using it? And then you go backwards and think, so what do we have to do to get to that future? And that's an idea that's percolating around a lot more in transportation planning, and I'm hoping we can really try to use that approach in more of these kind of projects, because our computer models just are failing us in a lot of ways.
Well, there's a lot of ways that the process works that really doesn't open up the discussion to downsizing facilities, like the environmental impact statement process, which originally environmentalists looked at it as a big victory to have environmental impact statements. But the process is so routinized and arcane now that it actually tends to work against opponents of major government facilities. Everything ends up in a routine with meetings that are hard to penetrate, calculations made that nobody understands except for the people that are proposing the project. And that also happens typically with the hearing process for these things, where they segment the audience instead of having everybody together so that they can have their pitchforks out and going after the administrators. They put them in little rooms with a hearing examiner, and then you go in there by yourself and speak to the bureaucracy, and then you leave and you never get together with anybody else. It kind of works against the First Amendment right to freedom of assembly. And so the process, Peter, in Milwaukee, you had to have in order for us to win on the freeway teardown, we had to have a process to involve the public that was outside the regular Wisconsin Department of Transportation process.
Yeah. Yeah, and we did that. Like I said, I mean, we did it not specifically for the freeway, but we did it as part of the plan and the vision for the entire downtown. And then when we did get the go-ahead to do the plans for the freeway removal, we did the very same thing, and we had public hearings. We had a big model, and we showed, we made changes based on input from property owners and a whole number of others. But it was a very open process. And it's funny. Let me just read a very quick quote, and you'll never guess who said it. It's, "Don't fall for technical jargon. In my book, an ounce of common sense is worth a ton of statistics. Don't succumb to counsels of despair." That's a quote by Robert
Moses. Yeah. I knew it. And that was his advice as long as he was talking to himself.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So we do have one question I want to get to here. What attributes make a particular highway a compelling candidate for conversion? I'll answer that very quickly, and then let the other people come in with whatever else they want to say about it. It helps if the freeway doesn't have a really big vehicle count, but if you really want to have it considered for replacement with a surface street, don't let that stop you, because in Seoul, South Korea, the vehicle count on the freeway they removed there was over 150,000 cars a day. But the one in Milwaukee was under 40,000 cars a day. The freeway in the Embarcadero, I think that was about 80,000 cars a day. And actually, no, it was higher than that. The central artery was a lower number, and that made it easier. But, typically the first reaction to proposing a freeway coming down will be, "Oh my God, we have all that traffic, what on earth would happen to it?" And the answer to that is that a lot of different things happen to it. Some of it disappears, some of it reroutes. People use the street grid. In some cases, they change their trips so they go to a completely different part of the metropolitan area, or use transit. Any of you want to comment on this question? How do you decide to do it?
I'll add two things. Yeah. I think if the highway is in need of being replaced or having a significant investment in repairing it, it opens up the question, so people are more open to considering different futures for it. And then second, if it's on, lots of cities have waterfront, riverfront highways, and cities everywhere are realizing that that's some of their most valuable public real estate. So if you can sort of get those two conditions to happen at the same time, of reconsidering uses for that land and reconsidering whether you can afford to rebuild the highway, that's the most fertile environment for this question to emerge.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would also just reinforce the leadership piece, that you have a leader a transformational leader in your city. I think the technical aspects of most of these elevated sections of freeway, especially those that were sub-ended or they're not actual through travel segments, have enormous potential. It's not so much a technical question as one of community and political will. And so, to me, I think it's really a question of, do you have leaders with the fortitude to raise the question, ask the hard questions, and be persuasive as well as persistent.
Yeah, on the leadership question, Peter, I think that it's great if the executive leader of the city, the mayor, can lead the way, but sometimes that doesn't happen, and you still get a good outcome. Like the Lower West Side of Manhattan, it was the people in Tribeca, Chelsea, Greenwich Village, the area along the West Side Highway, who organized themselves. They were the descendants of Jane Jacobs and other people that had fought these battles for years. And ultimately, they recruited Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the senator from New York. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan, of course, went on to be the author of Ice-T and all kinds of reforms at the federal level. But once they had him on their side, they made it. A similar thing in San Francisco, where it was the neighborhood that had felt victimized by the Embarcadero and by the Central Artery, both neighborhoods. And they went to their mayor at the time, Art Agnos, and pleaded with him to help. And he said that, I'm not going to take the lead on it, but if you guys go along, if you guys push it, I'll do what I can to help. And the same thing happened with the next person who was mayor. You can't always depend on having your elected official being crazy enough to want to tear down, freeways without it first being sort of vetted in the public mind as not being a crazy idea. Because the first reaction usually is, you want to do what? You want to tear that? What?
That's right.
It takes a while for that. So one of the things that groups can do is make it a lot easier for elected officials to make the right decision.
So we just got another question. Are there any good examples of depressed freeways being replaced? Because it seems like the elevated freeways are certainly more costly to rebuild.
Good point. Lucy or Peter, or you want to go
I'm not aware of any that have been replaced. There has one example in Cincinnati, I-75 along the river was already depressed, and they did a major project where they actually tightened it up quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And removed some of the exits and interchanges.
They extended the block structure of downtown Cincinnati across the freeway so that the waterfront was connected on almost every block.
Right, and so by tightening it up, they were able to increase. There's a lot of bridges. And they got rid of exits so there wasn't this sort of impact, like Cary was talking about, of traffic dumping into your downtown. So, and I think the general feeling is it's not so bad having a depressed highway because the impact's a little less visible
dream,
or whatever.
The dream I once had late at night after reading, Robert Moses's book or whatever, Robert Caro's book about Robert Moses, was that there would be a depressed freeway and it would be ended as a freeway, and they'd put a transit line in the cut and create a new transit line. Now that nobody's done that yet in the U.S. We're going to have to check around the world because these freeway teardowns are starting to happen all over the world now. Paris is going to remove the Pompidou, the auto route Pompidou along the Seine, and of course Seoul did theirs. They're talking about removing several freeways in Japan. We'll have to see if any of those are depressed.
I think
also Peter Harnick from, I'm sorry, real quick, but Peter Harnick from the Trust for Public Land has written in and said that there's actually extensive data on decking over depressed freeways with parkland on their website. So, or if not on their website, available through the Trust for Public Land. And he also writes in that there are at least 25 instances of park decks over depressed freeways. So we'll have to tap into that resource. Thanks for the contribution, Peter. And I'm sorry, Cary, you were about to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say I think parts of the Paris freeway are depressed, so that would be a great case study to look at.
Definitely. Well, we have another question. If there isn't transformational leadership in place, how do we tee up elected officials to make a decision in favor of highway removal? Cary, do you have any ideas of ways to get that elected official teed up?
I think we, over the course of 5 years, we built a lot of support among elected officials. By the end of this fight, we had the mayor on our side, the county executive, the head of the state DOT, city DOT, and county DOT were all on record saying our solution was the most sensible, most obvious, most cost-effective choice. But so we did build a lot of leadership slowly over time, you know, with the facts, with the data, with the sensible arguments, with the vision. But I think, you know, what we didn't do, and I think it's going to be an obstacle for a lot of cities, is the venue for decision-making is the state DOT, typically, if it's a state route. And if they can control the money, it's really an uphill battle. So as Lucy was saying, you really have to show them some sort of benefit to them, whether it's they can move this money that they were going to spend on the highway somewhere else, or I don't know what might work in each situation, but you have to find a benefit for the state DOT if they're the key kind of holder of the money and the decision. And obviously we didn't do that, and someone pointed out, and I think they were accurate, that for state DOTs, I mean for state governments, often highways are the only visible thing they can point to as your tax dollars at work. So often they're even more stubborn about, you know, letting go of that because they want to show people, here's what we're doing with your money, here's our investment in your community. So I think it's a really tricky question because sometimes even a lot of political support and a lot of data still isn't enough if the politics at the state are out of your control.
What happened in Seattle, Cary, is, you know, there's a traditional support of public works projects that comes from, you know, obviously the construction trades, the contractors, what's sometimes called the road lobby. And at some point in the process, they'll always say, well, we've had enough talk. We need the jobs. We've got to get this done. We've argued about this enough. Let's build it.
Right.
And one thing I would suggest that people do before that moment happens, and it almost always does, is to lay the groundwork for people to understand that you're not against spending money on construction necessarily, or that you're against roads or against the car. You know, Cary, you are for streets and pavement. In Milwaukee, we didn't replace the freeway with dandelions. We replaced it with a street. It cost a lot of money to, you know, I mean, it actually is more labor intensive to build a street than it is to build the freeway in some cases. And so the, you know, the construction trades, you need to deal with them early on. The situation in New Orleans, you have a frightened potential opponent, or at least concerned potential opponent of tearing down the Claiborne, is the Port of New Orleans, their customers, the truck companies that move goods and so forth. And so you need to talk to them early, which is starting to happen. The coalition there is beginning to talk to them, and even though there's not going to be agreement and there'll be pushback for a while, but the dialogue needs to happen so that they understand that you're intent isn't necessarily hostile to them, and that there are issues that they need to think about and consider before they automatically oppose it. So, that's one thing that I would recommend in answering that question is you really, really need to prepare the arguments. Now, the next question we have is there's a lot of talk about traffic, but what about the increase in economic development and livability? How to quantify? Well, that is a very good question, and it's good to do that without it just being bald assertions, which is often what you get in the world of government economic development estimates. But a good way to do that is to look at the land values that already exist, and also look at places where there have been insertions of expressways and see what the effect has been on real estate values. You can do local comparisons. We have some national comparisons. The Center for Neighborhood Technology does some of that work as well, so we can help you with that. And it gets to the basic question when you combine it with livability, what is the road for? And in the urban context, a busy street has more duties than just moving traffic. It's there for commerce at the street level, for dining and sale of goods and services, and it's there as a social place, as a gathering place. So the road has more purposes than just moving traffic. And convincing the state and federal authorities of that when you're deciding what to do with these infrastructure decisions, that's really important. You got to get right down to the basics. And also, some of the traditional objective they have is to defeat. They always use military terminology, to conquer congestion, to defeat it, to eliminate congestion. But if you're looking at a city in terms of a retailer like Cary Moon's Pioneer Square Business Association, they look at congestion in a more positive way. There's bad things about congestion, but there's also good things about congestion. Congestion means that the place is vibrant and prosperous and people are buying things and there's lots of people there. So eliminating congestion isn't the highest priority of retail merchants like those in Pioneer Square. Imagine if you eliminated the congestion in Greenwich Village in New York. It would probably destroy most of the real estate value there. It'd be a great place to drive a truck through if they built the Lower Manhattan Expressway through the middle of Greenwich Village, but it would have destroyed a lot of the retail and a lot of the real estate value. And if you want to see the ultimate example of the expression of the functional classification system trying to reach traffic level A, you can look at Detroit, where congestion is probably the least of the problems in Detroit. They've conquered it, basically, by building lots of roads. They ripped out all the streetcar lines, created super blocks, degraded the Woodward complex street grid, which I happen to think is actually superior to the Burnham plan in Chicago. But they spent billions and billions of dollars trying to speed up traffic in Detroit, and as a result, it's not congested. It's successful. The U.S. DOT and the Michigan DOT, take a bow. You did it. You decongested the city. Congratulations. But obviously, there's other things that are more important than decongesting a city, and having commerce and having a social setting where people want to be is much more important.
And I'll add to that it's very hard to get factual numbers, as John said, about predicting the future economic changes, but case studies are really valuable. And the two cities that have done a lot of data analysis of what happened after are San Francisco and the Embarcadero and Seoul, Korea. So Google them and you'll find both cities have done some pretty good assessment of the positive benefits afterward.
Great.
And one other thing about San Francisco is that the city did a study later on that showed that the majority of trips actually shortened up, because instead of having a freeway that dropped you at just a few places, The Embarcadero connects to the street grid on most of the blocks along the Embarcadero. So you could go where you wanted to go. You didn't have to overshoot your destination and come back. And it changed the purpose of the Embarcadero. It became more important to distributing traffic instead of moving through traffic. And so people that were going from Oakland to Marin County didn't look at Fisherman's Wharf and the neighborhoods along the bay there as the place to drive through, and they took their through traffic somewhere else. Increased air pollution from stopping at intersections has been expressed as a concern. Are roundabouts a practical solution? Well, the increased air pollution that happens from stopping is actually way outweighed if you eliminate the stopping. If you grade separated the entire city, like say Brasilia, you don't have stoplights. You have grade separated intersections, and in almost the entire capital of Brasilia until you get to the slums where all the cultural and real estate value tends to be. By having something where you drive continuously, it pushes the drive sheds way out into the countryside, lengthens trips, and you end up creating more pollution than you do when you have some tight intersections with stoplights. Roundabouts, that's an interesting thing. Roundabouts are not an automatic solution. You can build a giant roundabout that functions like a freeway interchange. You can have a roundabout where you just you put a monument in the middle of an intersection and traffic just uses that to move around. You don't need the stoplights. Hans Monderman, the great planner and traffic planner from Holland, was a great fan of roundabouts, but also just intersections without traffic lights or stop signs. The whole province of the Frisian Islands, where he was the traffic planner, they eliminated all stop signs, stop lights, not always with a roundabout. Sometimes just they took the signs and stoplights out. The biggest city in the Frisian Islands is a little over 50,000, so it's not necessarily an example of every place. But after he did that, for several years, I don't know what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, but I saw Hans Monderman 4 years ago in London when we had him at our CNU Transportation Summit, and he said there had been no traffic fatalities in the years since they had eliminated all these things. They went from, they didn't have a lot of traffic fatalities before, but they'd had none after they eliminated all the signs that were supposed to be for safety. So it's an interesting subject. In Europe, it's called the shared space movement. Over here, it doesn't have a name yet. There's a guy named David Hamilton Bailey, who's a traffic planner out of Britain, who is probably the most articulate person in the shared space movement now. And if you ever have a big conference and you want to invite a great speaker, David Hamilton Bailey is a good guy to bring in to talk about this. But anyway, I would just say that roundabouts they can be a practical solution. I think in a densely populated, complex, fine-grained urban grid, you don't want to have to tear down buildings to create a circle, but you can get the same effect of a traffic circle by just putting a monument or something in the middle and then eliminating the traffic signals or signs and see how that works. Oftentimes it works really well. In fact, I don't know any place where it doesn't work well.
John, it's Ben Hamilton Bailey, not David.
I'm sorry. Thank you for that correction.
Yeah.
We've been looking at roundabouts at some of our projects, and there are some great examples of really good urban design, walkable roundabouts, and there are some really bad suburban, over-designed roundabouts. And so it could be a good design solution for a boulevard, and it's important to communicate that they can be great places for pedestrians, because some examples people may have in their mind are not so great.
Yeah, the ones that have the fluted ramps coming off of them, and where they tear down buildings in order to put the roundabout in place, watch out for that. I mean, really, a roundabout should fit into the existing built landscape, or it's probably too big if it requires any demolition. That's a good rule to follow on those.
And I'll just add one more
All right.
point.
Well, we've had a great session here, and I really appreciate everybody participating. And I'm now going to turn it over to Caitlin to give the benediction here at the end. Go ahead.
Thanks. Well, we also want to extend a special thank you to Cary Moon, Peter Park, and Lucy Gibson for their contributions on the call today. And if you want to stay engaged with CNU's Highways to Boulevards initiative and connect with other activists across the country, we actually have an online forum, and it's called cnu.org/HWYS Highways Forum. So you can stay tuned there for the upcoming release of the 2012 Freeways Without Futures report, and also stay tuned for a summary of this meeting and a recording available. So feel free to pass out that information to your friends and those who are interested in urban freeway replacement. So thank you so much, and this concludes our call today.
Thank you. Please stand by.